The topic for today's podcast is Inquiry Learning with Kath Murdoch. Unpacking Education is brought to you by AVID. AVID believes in seeing the potential of every student. To learn more about AVID, visit their website at avid.org. Our quote for today is from our guest, and it's on Kath Murdoch's blog. She writes, "The act of investigation is inevitably cyclical." All right, Winston, what are your thoughts about that quote today?
The part that sticks out to me is the fact it's an act. I think sometimes when we have students do investigation and we're trying to have them develop inquiry skills, it's really catered and just very specifically here the teacher provides them with where they should end up. And I think sometimes having students have the freedom to go and really investigate and find that thing, and it's like, oh, but what about this? And then really dig into that. I think that act of investigation, that authentic act of investigation, is cyclical. So I think providing authentic acts of investigation really does provide that. So I love that quote, but also that part of acting feels important to me.
For sure. Yeah, and I think about, investigation and asking questions. And for some reason, our kids stop asking questions at some point in their school careers, and we've got to do something about that. We got to keep them asking questions, being curious, because that curiosity and those questions, that drives that inquiry process and keeps them going. And I learn a little bit, now I have a new question and I need to go further. And now I have another new question and I need to go even further. And there's that cycle as I see it anyway. So for sure. All right, well, we are excited to have Kath Murdoch with us today on the podcast. Kath is from Melbourne, Australia. She's an international thought leader in the area of inquiry learning. She is an experienced primary teacher, a writer, university lecturer, and consultant. She's been teaching, researching, and writing about inquiry learning for 40 years. She's written 17 books in that time, including the best-selling titles The Power of Inquiry and Getting Personal with Inquiry Learning. Hey, welcome, Kath.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So that's the little blurb about you, but do you want to give
Mhm.
us a little more personal account of who is Kath Murdoch?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. Um,
It is.
oh yeah, I don't know. It depends what you want to know. I mean, I'm a teacher. That's who I am, as well as a mum and a partner and all of those other things. But I'm a teacher. I'm a primary school teacher. It's my in my heart always. It's where I'm most at home professionally is actually not in a workshop room, not in a lecture theatre, but in a classroom with children. And I'm very fortunate that I've been able to develop a kind of consultancy that means I've manipulated things so that I spend a lot of time teaching children, albeit in front of a bunch of other teachers. But yeah, so I work mainly with children from sort of 3, 4 years old through to sort of about year seven ish, but mostly in that kind of primary area. And I've been doing so for a surprise. I surprised myself when I realize it's been 42 years. I can't believe that's coming out of my mouth. But there you go, 4 decades four and a bit decades in what I consider to be one of the most important and privileged jobs in the world.
Mm.
For sure.
Thank you so much for sharing the other parts of you, including being a mother and a partner.
Yeah.
That really helps. I think for our audience, and just like that, there is
Hmm.
growth and a person behind the individuals we're talking to. So,
Oh gosh,
right.
absolutely. In fact, it's so interesting that I think being lucky enough to be able to have children when I wanted to have children taught me so much about learning and about teaching, and I think really changed me as a teacher too. And that will always be by far my greatest passion, I think. is you know, what you learn with and from your own children. And the other passion I have is for the natural environment, and that's a big. I've had a big focus on environmental education over the years too. So that's been a really lovely layer to it all. So yeah,
I appreciate you helping our audience ground
mm,
themselves in who you are as a full
thank
person,
you.
and thank you for sharing that with
Yeah,
us. So you've mentioned your passion with
thank
the
you.
environment, just the idea of youth learning, which is also why we all do this work as well, right?
Yes,
So,
yeah.
to get more specific into our transition into the conversation in our
Mm-hmm.
podcast is, how do you define high quality inquiry learning,
Mm,
right? And then the second part of that question is,
mm.
how did it become a passion of yours? Like, why was that thing the thing that drove you?
They're both really lovely questions, and I really appreciate that you've used the phrase high quality. Maybe in some ways, I can define it best by defining low quality inquiry. Low quality inquiry learning being what is often used as an argument against the approach. Low quality would be simply asking children what they're interested in and saying, hey guys, that's great, off you go. Find out, I've put a bunch of resources around the room, see what you can find out. That very loosey-goosey approach. I don't know teachers that do that. I think a lot of that is a bit of a mythology, um, but it's low quality when it lacks guidance and structure and purpose and authenticity and clarity. It's high quality when the thinking behind it, well, I mean, we know that inquiry it's grounded in, and I don't want to get too academic here, but it's important to acknowledge that it's grounded in a theory of learning that we know of as constructivism, which very simply put is this idea that the learner is the one doing the learning. The learner is building an understanding over time. It's this process of never ending synthesis. You've got your prior knowledge, your prior experiences, you're exposed to new information. Ideally, you're given opportunities to process, recalibrate, have new theories about the way the world works. And so it goes, a bit like you were saying with that quote about this constant cyclical process. So when it's working, I think the educator's really clear about that they're supporting that. I can't remember who the writer was, but I read an article that described inquiry as an approach that goes with the grain of the brain. That this idea that we are gradually and continually um, coming to understand and then coming to kind of re-understand the world around us. So I think it works beautifully when that is supported. I mean, obviously, if the educator is driven by those key values of curiosity, agency, deep learning, and authenticity. You mentioned authenticity before. I think where I see it working best, you can see teachers very intentionally positioning the child as the researcher. They see the child as a researcher and they also see themselves as a researcher, which is a very, very much something we've learned from Reggio Emilia, this concept of our image of the child as a capable, curious, um, early researcher, quite capable of inquiring, and our role being to research alongside them, and the children themselves being our constant source of information. Um, I think the other thing I'd say about it being high quality is when it's truly responsive, when we stay constantly open to what we're noticing. We're great observers. If we're good inquiry teachers, we're listening, we're observing, and our designs for learning happen. We're projecting our designs, but we're also constantly reshaping. those designs based on what we're noticing. It's a very sophisticated way of working. I'd have to say that it's complex, it's beautiful, and it can be so satisfying for teachers and learners, but it's not without its complexity.
So it is very complex, and sometimes it's hard to visualize, exactly what that
Mm,
might look like in a classroom. Could you
hmm
give us an example or two of what inquiry learning might look like in an actual classroom?
Yes, many. In fact, you saying that because of its complexity, it can be hard to visualize it. And that's why I and many of my colleagues really do try to do a lot of work in classrooms so that people can hear and see it in action. It is the best way to understand the nuance and the complexity. But okay, so what it might look like, I mean, there are dozens of examples I could give you, of course, but in the very early years, what it might look like to the ill-informed or untrained eye, it might look like just playing with very young children. Play is perhaps the purest form of inquiry. What you would see in an early years classroom would be a very intentionally curated environment that invites young learners to explore, to figure out, to collaborate with educators observing, documenting, listening, and what my beautiful colleague Matt Glover describes as nudging, or perhaps provoking next moves. So it might look like that, like quite a strong play based context, or it might be let's take an art room, let's take an art teacher that is introducing a group of children to the material of clay. And in that environment, and this is being a little bit simplistic, but just to provide an example, it might be the teacher that provides the clay and invites the children to first explore what do you know, what does the clay do? What are you noticing about it? Explore its properties, explore what happens when you manipulate it, share what you discover with each other, and then once the teachers heard some of those reflections and observed and listened, then they might step in to provide some explanation and modelling and demonstration. So you'll often see a teacher choosing to give kids exploration time before explanation time. Um, and I guess another example would be where a class of children collaboratively. So, as a class, we call them shared inquiries, where we are over several weeks. We're journeying through a process to investigate a big question. It might be a question like, what does it mean to be healthy, or what makes a strong community, or um, what do designers have to keep in mind when they're designing something. That's a clumsy question. It's not exactly that, but where they've got a what we call just a big, compelling question, and over several weeks, they work through a process together to kind of uncover and deepen their understanding. So I can see it at lesson level. I can see it as a deep, extended investigation, um, and it might be even an example of a philosophical inquiry. It might look like a group of children in a circle engaging in a philosophical conversation where the educator is artfully questioning and probing. That is a form of inquiry. It's a very broad idea, inquiry. People often associate it with that's when you do units of inquiry, but they're an abundance. I would consider project based, problem based, three act math, um, philosophical inquiry. These are all avenues through which we can engage children as active inquirers.
And then as they get older, how does
Mm.
that ownership and inquiry change?
Well, as they get older, what changes? It's interesting when I do work with teachers from, and I did this not long ago, over 2 days from preschool through to year 12. the underlying principles of ownership, agency, creativity, authenticity, learning to learn, those underlying principles don't change. The content changes, of course. The complexity of the ideas that the students are expected to work with changes to some degree. The capacity to work through a process more independently might increase as students get older. But as I say that, I say it very tentatively because I work in preschools and sometimes I see much more agency, responsibility, and independence in a group of 4-year-olds than I might see walking into a year 9 classroom. So I'm not even sure that it's the level of it maybe it's the teacher's willingness to release responsibility that changes rather than the student's capacity to manage it.
Ooh, that goes back to our quote from earlier in Paul's conversation about how students are, that curiosity is removed from them as they go further and further through school.
Mm,
But there's something that you're also mentioning, which is terrifying, to give students complete control of their learning. Sometimes as a teacher, that idea of turning over the classroom can be difficult. So what I want to ask you is, like,
yeah,
what are some things that teachers need to do in order to cultivate in themselves this ability to implement inquiry learning in the classroom, right? Because that might be terrifying to
yeah,
me. I don't know to ask the right questions. So what are some of the
yeah.
things that teachers could work on in order to implement and develop an inquiry based discourse in their classroom? What are some things that they could develop in themselves?
Mm. That's a beautiful question because what that acknowledges is that so much of our um, ability to use this pedagogy depends on how we see ourselves and the dispositions that we have as educators. I would say, just going back to something that you said earlier or a moment ago, handing over complete control. That's not what happens. It isn't that. It is uh, very much. It's really important, actually, that the educator continues to see themselves as having the responsibility to guide those students. I think that can be, and maybe that's one of the steps towards this, is understanding, not buying into or being seduced by the idea that, oh, when you use an inquiry based approach, it's sheer chaos because the kids rule the they're it's not that at all. And in fact, I wrestle with the idea that people talk about there's guided inquiry and that there's this kind of inquiry and that kind of inquiry, at least from the perspective of a primary educator. I think my role is always one of guidance. Always, it's always guided. The level of guide, and maybe if you see that, if you say, okay, so first of all, I'm not relinquishing the responsibility I have as an educator to guide. You absolutely are doing that, and you're doing it actively. I'm not even a fan of the notion of guide on the side. That feels a little bit too passive. You're very actively and very intentionally, you're making multiple moves across the day to support and guide your students, all the while seeing them as agents of their learning, co-agents, with you. So I think that's an important understanding to have. The level of guidance will, I'm going like this because I've got an illustration in one of my books of, a like a graphic equalizer or a sound deck in a recording studio where there's all the different volume controls. And the image I always have in my head is that sometimes the volume's going up for, okay, I need to step in and take more if you like, control and guidance. Oh, actually, I can pull it down now. And I'm always wanting to pull it down a little to give the students more of that, as my colleague Guy Claxton calls it, I want them to build learning muscle. And they won't do that if I'm doing too much for them. But at the same time, remain responsible for supporting them in developing that muscle. So, and that's going to depend on individual students. It's going to depend on the curriculum that we're working with, and so on. So I think that's one thing, is cultivating yourself an understanding and a reassurance of your role as guide. I think, I mean, the very obvious one, but it's worth saying, and it goes back to the research on curiosity, which no one used to talk about, and it's so delightful that everyone talks about curiosity right now. After 40 years, it's like, yes. So researchers like Susan Engel have identified that the most important factor in generating a classroom environment in which children are curious is the degree to which the educator does two things. One, that they are genuinely curious, not fake curiosity. I see plenty of that, but they're genuinely curious. So they're modeling it. And secondly, that they respond to their students' thinking with curiosity. So you've got to cultivate that within you. I think just being a learner, just feeling like, I mean, whenever I do a lesson with a group of children, I always start by saying, I know I'm going to learn something over the next hour. I don't know what I'm going to learn, but I cannot wait to the end of this lesson. And you're going to ask me, Kath, what did you learn today? And every single time they ask me, I've got something to say. And I love that. I want them to see me as a learner, because we know that strengthens their sense of themselves as learners. And I think that, I mean, being a risk taker, being courageous, being curious, being a learner. And the last thing I'd say is just be, mm, i- is willing to really collaborate with your students and with your colleagues. Um, this this approach is so much stronger when you're better together, is what I want to say. You're better when you're engaged in conversations with your colleagues and you're talking about what you're noticing and what steps might we take next, and come into my room and can you take a look at that, or want you to watch me teach this. Can you help me see what I might not be seeing, and so on. So I think that just that open mindedness, it doesn't suit everyone and it doesn't suit everybody's personality. And that's not to say that teachers that use a highly didactic approach can't be really effective too. Can't put a square peg into a round hole, but if you want to cultivate it, they would be the things I would do.
I really appreciate your way of putting the teacher in, reminding them that they are in power and the guide to students' learning. So sometimes we have one system that I know of is the Socratic method, or Socratic seminar is one way of providing an
Hmm.
inquiry based framework for
Mm,
a classroom. Could you
yeah.
provide some examples of what are some inquiry frameworks or processes that you could recommend to help teachers
Mm,
guide students in their inquiry? Because again, the Socratic
hmm.
has rules of how the teacher can engage.
Yeah.
What are some ways that
Yeah.
strategies or processes that you can provide?
Yeah. There are many. I'm just going to think of two. One is, I'm going to shout out to the beautiful work of Project Zero, Harvard's Project Zero, in particular, the thinking routines that my colleagues, Ron Richard, Mark Church, and others have published. Now, so many of the thinking routines, even if we think about some of the most simple, popular ones like See, Think, Wonder, or Connect, Extend, Challenge, or What Makes You Say That? These small but powerful routines, when we use them, they gradually help shift culture in the classroom towards a more inquiry based way of being. So I would say, if you want a toolkit of strategies that isn't overwhelming, but that you can start to apply to any subject area, and and encourage children to start to be more active in their thinking, and to help you see what kids are capable of doing, then the visible thinking routines from the Project Zero work would be it's a great go-to. And then I guess, I would also argue that understanding and using a cycle of inquiry. Now, I've got a cycle that I use. There are others, um, that, but mostly they're more similar than they are different. So if you were using the one that I work with, then you would learn how to design learning so that you are tuning in first. So we call it tuning into children's thinking, and there are a range of strategies we can use to connect with their working theories about whatever it is you're moving into. Then we have a phase that we think of as finding out or investigating. We're positioning them as researchers, and that's guided. We're developing research skills along the way. A phase I call sorting out or meaning making, which is making sense of that information, followed by a phase that, well, I'm saying followed by as if it's a straight line. It's not. It's messier in practice, but that going further phase, which is where new questions are bubbling up to explore, perhaps moving on more divergent paths. We talk about drawing conclusions, pulling it together, reflecting, what have we learned? And we also talk about an element in that process of doing. So what? what what are we going to do with this learning? And that's where the work of people like Ron Berger comes into play. There's, real learning for real purposes and real audiences, and that idea of developing beautiful work for real purposes. So that inquiry process characterize when you learn what each of those elements is, what the purpose of each element is, you can start to both teach with those purposes in mind and also design the learning with those purposes in mind. And the children become aware of those phases too, which allows them to also develop their own inquiry journeys. Now, it doesn't have to be that language. As I say, there are plenty of models of a cycle of inquiry, but I think that can be really helpful. So small routines and big cycles are both really powerful.
I think that's helpful for teachers who want to get into this because there's I think, a tendency to be nervous about how do I do this? I need some
Mm.
kind of a structure to kind of
Mm.
guide me through. And then you will have some teachers who say, but how can I do this? I have my curriculum that I have to teach.
Mm.
How can I teach
Mm.
like this when I have all that stuff that I have to cover?
Hmm.
What do you say to those teachers?
Well, I'm one of those. I don't say that, but I am a teacher that does have to use curriculum. I don't work
Yeah,
in
yeah.
many places I mean, we have the Australian curriculum that I work with. If I'm in British Columbia, I'm working with that curriculum. If I'm in the UK, I might be working with the English curriculum and so on. Um, or the Common Core. The way I see it is that the curriculum tells you the what, but inquiry is not about the what, it's about the how. So I can choose to use an inquiry approach to help uncover the curriculum that I am responsible for teaching. And I won't choose to use it for everything. That's the other thing. There'll be some things that I think, you know what, this is either quite a shallow piece in the curriculum, it's a must do, it's non negotiable. I'm going to choose to use inquiry where depth is required, and I may use more um, direct instruction if that suits the content. So it's nuanced in that way. But my advice to teachers is always, in fact, my friend Sam Sherritt once said this to me, that make friends with the curriculum. it's not an impediment. The more you understand it, and I'm a bit of a curriculum nerd, the more you have it in your head, the more you understand it, the more it stops bossing you around so much. You can see, here's this fantastic opportunity. That thinking of an example not long ago of grade one children coming in after lunchtime full of anxiety about the fact that there were these baby birds that they thought had been thrown out of the nest that were in the schoolyard. And the teacher had set the stage for her math lesson she was about to do, but being a true inquiry teacher, could see we've got so much learning that can come out of this moment, and chose, and you're not going to do this every day, abandon your plan, but gosh, the sky does not fall in when you do. So because she knew her curriculum really well, she was able to quickly pivot and move into a little mini inquiry around that. And at the same time, she's clocking in her mind and then later actually auditing her standards for biological science, for design. This is in Australia, biological science, design technologies, aspects of our humanities curriculum. It was all there in that one lesson. Know your curriculum. Make friends with it. Stick it up on the wall. With older kids, show them the standards. Show them where what they're doing is connected to the curriculum. Don't make it secret teacher's business. Um, it's not your enemy unless you make it so.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. It's and, not or, right? It's and.
Mm, mm. The inquiry is the approach. So I don't, it almost feels like what do you mean when people say to me, but I've got to cover this content? Yeah. And you can do that using an inquiry-based approach. Just because it's content doesn't mean I have to pour it in their heads. I can understand the content and design a learning experience that allows children to uncover that content, not by themselves, but more for themselves, which is more engaging. And again, I'm not going to do it like that every single minute of every day, but when it is done like that, it is super engaging and it sticks because curiosity drove it.
One of the best things about learning is that it's always consistent. There's a rule to, oh, this is somewhat valuable. Are there any skills needed for students to go and learn before participating in an inquiry approach? So, is there anything that we need to pre teach in order for students to be successful in inquiry based approaches?
I certainly think that of course, there are many, many, many skills that that adept inquirers have in their toolkit, and we need to be really clear about those skills. I think it's less about pre-teaching and more about being clear as we're journeying through an inquiry. What are the demands on the children in terms of those skills, and where might we pause to lift those skills up and be more explicit about them? I think you can both, I think they're best taught in the context of the inquiry, but not assumed. We can lift it up as it's happening. So let me give you an example of one of the most obvious skills that an inquirer needs is to be able to frame the right question for their investigation. Now, yeah, I can do some standalone lessons on questions, but actually it's more effective if we might generate some questions together in at a certain point in the inquiry, and then I'm going to use those questions to kind of press the pause button and say to kids, okay, we've got a whole lot of questions here, but before we decide which questions are going to be best for our survey or our interview or whatever we're doing, we need to learn more about which questions are going to work best. So let's take these questions and let's explore them. And I might do a concept attainment strategy or something with the questions. I might use, the quadrants, but I always feel like I'm stepping to the side of the inquiry in order to make that skill more explicit, develop it, and then bring it back in and keep going, rather than I need to teach them all of this stuff first and then we can inquire. Be explicit, embed it, but highlight along the way. And that requires the educators, as the inquiry is being designed, to be asking that question. What are the skills that students will need in order to be successful here? There are, again, dozens of different frameworks that identify skills and dispositions that are, if you like, generic to effective learning. There's, if in the IB schools, there are the approaches to learning and the learner profile. Guy Claxton has his learning powers. There's the 16 habits of mind that I think of it as the OG, the original dispositions. I think in one of my books, I identified over 20 different frameworks. I use what I call learning assets. Here are the skills and dispositions that are an asset to you if you are inquiring into something effectively. And we just talk about five or six big ones: thinking skills, collaboration skills, self-management skills, communication skills, research skills, and I added a sixth one um, that was the skills needed for contribution or active citizenship, the making a difference um, skills and dispositions associated with each one. So when I'm working with teachers, we're always scanning those lists, and many of them line up with particular skills in curricula, in mandated curricula too. And so we just try to establish what we're going to put in the spotlight. A great inquiry-based lesson, often children will be drawing on all of those assets, but I'm choosing, or we are choosing, to spotlight certain ones and make it really clear to students. So we use what we call split screen learning intentions. We'll activate a question that we're exploring in that lesson, and we will put the spotlight on and let kids know too that while we're investigating this, we're also strengthening these, and I'm borrowing Guy Claxton's language again here, we're strengthening these learning muscles. While we're listening to this scientist explain how they go about protecting this endangered animal, we're also, as researchers, strengthening our capacity to take notes so that we can go back and remember the information we've heard. So in any lesson, I'm toggling between both the what of the learning and the how of the learning, but both elements are, are developed with an inquiry stance from both the teacher and the learner.
I'm also thinking as you're talking about this, you mentioned it earlier as well, that it's a different feel to an inquiry classroom where
Mm,
maybe
mm.
students are more independent at times, but teachers feel like that's chaos a little bit, that it's not managed. And you clearly
Yeah.
said that it is managed.
Mm,
But what are
mm.
some of those practical ways that a teacher can manage
Yeah.
that environment when it's
Yeah.
maybe a little looser than they're used to?
Yes, often think of that phrase, as you might have heard, tight but loose. It's really interesting that idea that a lot of creatives talk about, where in order to be creative, you need constraints. And I think that's, or the constraints can lead to greater creativity. Too much choice, too, uh, if a task is so open-ended that there's nothing to hang on to, there's no framework, there's no structure, we're going to fall back into that loosey-goosey stuff that we talked about earlier, that inquiry gets a bad name for. I actually find that the classrooms I work in where this approach is strongest have, first of all, they've got really clear routines. There are routines that ensure that there's a sense, that important sense that we all need of predictability and safety and belonging. And that's particularly important for our young learners in a primary school. When you've got those sort of predictable routines, um, a moment like the baby birds falling out of the nest can be dealt with beautifully because the class is held by this sense of, I'm going to say, structure. There's people often, when I work in a school and I'm teaching and so on, they'll often say, oh, there's actually quite a lot of structure here, isn't it? Absolutely, there is. So, with routines, clear structures, being, I think the other thing that avoids that kind of sense, if you like, of chaos or, oh, this is out of control, is that we work really hard, particularly early in the year, on building agreements with the students. Here are the agreed ways that we learn and work together. This is what it means to be a functioning member of this classroom community. And I'm not talking so much about rules, but agreed behaviours for learning and agreed behaviours for being with each other. And they're co constructed and they're regularly revisited. I guess the third thing I would say is I am a big fan of the circle that we all, the lessons I do, we always begin in a circle, we end in a circle. And that's one of our rituals. We learn how to have, and we have to learn it even more now, we learn how to have sustained, respectful dialogue with each other. And if we can do that, if we can develop that kind of deep, respectful discourse, again, we're holding the students in this beautiful community of learning and inquiry. It's highly intentional. I don't want the kids to feel like they don't know why they're doing what they're doing. So we are doing a lot of co-construction and um, and a lot of clear intentions.
Yeah, that's fabulous. I can see that classroom in my mind, with the
Yeah.
students in a circle and all communicating and working on
Yep.
the same problem or a similar problem.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
It does take time though, to develop. It doesn't happen overnight. People need to feel comfortable or comforted in that regard. It takes time.
For sure. Well, we could take a lot more time talking about inquiry in this conversation, but I think we need to jump into our next segment, which is our toolkit.
Mm.
Check it out. Check it out. Check it out. Check it out. What's in the toolkit? What is in the toolkit? What's in the toolkit? Check it out.
All right, it's toolkit time. We're going to have Winston go first. I'll add something, and then Kath will let you follow up.
Okay.
So, Winston, what would you like to drop in our toolkit today?
For me, the thing that I would like to drop in the toolkit is the curriculum.
Yeah.
Know your curriculum so that you can know when to bend it and when to adjust in order to fit the needs of your students. The more you know it, the better you can serve your students with making adjustments and teacher moves.
That's great. And I like the idea of picking a strategy. It could be a small strategy, but some kind of a process that you teach your students and that you can reuse in different situations. Maybe it's a question asking routine. There's the question formulation technique, the QFT from the Right Question Institute. That's one. There's many, many out there. Pick something that you want to try to implement and teach your students, and then use it consistently so it becomes sort of a habit for the students. It just becomes part of how you do things in the classroom. All right, Kath, what would you like to add to the toolkit?
Oh, it's just like asking me to choose my favorite child. I can't do it. So many. But the one, I think, having just come off the back of a little moment in the forest yesterday, I think for me, if you can learn to slow down and notice when you are teaching, that is the best gift you can give yourself, even purely for your for assessment purposes. So I'd say deliberately saying, I am going to talk less, I'm going to observe and listen. I'm going to design a task, and for 10 minutes, I'm just going to really tune in to my students and see what I notice, or to a particular group of students. I'm going to do what the very, very best early years educators do and learn to listen, be the researcher, be the observer in my own classroom. It is so rich with reward when we do that.
That's great.
It's time for that one thing. It's time for that one thing.
It's that one thing.
And it's time for our one thing. It's time for our last piece of um, conversation for the day. What's keeping in your mind and rolling around, Paul? And then I'll jump in and ask Kat.
I'm going to go back to one of those misconceptions that inquiry learning is just a free for all. It is not just chaos in the classroom. And I love the quote. I pulled this out. It's not, we're having students do things not by themselves, but for themselves. I think that sums up a lot of it. You know, we're offering guidance, but they're doing it for themselves a little bit, and they're developing those skills. I really like that.
Yeah, and I'm going to piggyback off of you. I'm going to piggyback off of you with the idea of guidance. I think there is a sense of having leadership and authority that is valuable in being a guide to students' learning. And I think when teachers remember that they have a role, even when students are learning on their own, it's still very important. So I think reminding them that they are a guide is so valuable.
All right, Kath, your turn. What would you like to leave our listeners with, a final thought today?
I think when we were speaking towards the, or when I was speaking towards the end there about that idea of developing those skills and dispositions, those things that are assets to you as a learner, I was thinking about how for me, an inquiry-based approach, if I could show you a symbol now, it would be an arrow going outward and an arrow going inward simultaneously. That for a teacher, it means, yes, I'm outwardly teaching my students, but simultaneously, I'm also noticing and recognizing and being fascinated by what's happening in me as a teacher, and how I, Winston, as you said, how I modify the moves in response to what I'm noticing. And for children too, I see it as much an approach that helps them learn about the world around them, grow as scientists and mathematicians and writers and artists and so on, but also to grow the world within them, to understand themselves as learners and themselves as people. So it's inquiring out and it's inquiring in simultaneously. And if we can slow down enough to recognize and cultivate that in our classrooms, I think we're doing our children a real service. I hope we are.
I hope so too. That's beautiful. And we want to thank you, Kath, for joining us today. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And one last thing, if somebody's listening and they want to go further, their inquiry mind is turned on, they want to learn more from you, and they want to check out some of your books, where would they get those, and what might be a good starting point for them in the books that you've written?
Oh, yeah, they could just jump on the website. I'm going to apologize straight up that I'm not very good at keeping it up to date. But there are blog posts, and I think some of the books are mentioned on the site. So I'm sure if you just Googled, you'd find them. But there's an abundance of resources, not just by me. You've heard me mention some really incredible educators that I'm so lucky to collaborate with. So I just encourage people to read and not rely on. I'm going to say not rely on the on a TikTok or Instagram reel to learn about inquiry. Go read a book. That's my grumpy old lady moment for you right there. But read a book. Get in deep.
All right. Well, we better go do that then. We better go pick a book and dig deep. Thanks again so much for joining us.
My
Appreciate it.
absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Unpacking Education.
We invite you to visit us at avidopenaccess.org, where you can discover resources to support student agency and academic tenacity to create a classroom for future-ready learners.
And remember, go forth and be awesome.
Thank you for all you do.
You make a difference.